So we learned about function declarations and expressions in the last video, but there is actually a third type of function that was added to JavaScript in ES6, and that's the arrow function. And an arrow function is simply a special form of function expression that is shorter and therefore faster to write. So let's actually get back this function expression from before here, so from the previous lecture, just so that we have a comparison, so like a reference point. And so now let's write the arrow function. And this is how we write an arrow function. So again, we want the birth year because we want to calculate the age again. And then we write an arrow. And that's the reason why this function is called arrow function. And then we simply write what we want to return. So in this case, that's 2037 minus the birth year. And that's it. Now to finish, we actually want to be able to use this function. So let's again store it in a variable, just like we did here with this function expression. So let's say const calc age3 this time, and then we set that variable to this function here. Okay? So as I said, this is a special form of a function expression because it still is a function expression actually. So it's a value, all of this, that we assign to this variable. So just like this function expression up here. But this one, as you see, is a lot easier and faster to write. The first reason for that is that we don't need the curly braces, like we have here to define a code block. And second is that the return actually happens implicitly. So this value here will automatically be returned without us having to explicitly write the return keyword. Okay? So this is excellent for simple one-liner functions. And you will see throughout the course that this is going to be extremely helpful in certain situations. And now to use this function, it of course works the exact same way as using all the other functions. So we call calc age3 just like we called the other calc age functions. Okay. And again, we save the returned value here to a variable. And then let's just check it out here. And so this one should be 46 again, just like we had in the previous lecture. And yeah, it works. So indeed, the value that we calculated was returned automatically without us having to write the return keyword. And you see that here we also didn't need any parentheses or anything like that. Just this here is the function. Okay? Now this is actually just the simplest form, which is when we only have exactly one parameter and only basically one line of code in which we want to return something. But it gets a little bit more complex when we add more parameters or more code. So let's now write another function, and we can get rid of this one since it was just a copy anyway. And so let's say that we want to calculate how many years a person has left until retirement. So let's call this function years until retirement. And then we set that equal to a function. And once again, let's pass in the birth year. Then the arrow again. But now here we need some more code. Because to calculate the number of years until the retirement based on the birth year alone, we first need to calculate the age. And then from there, we need to calculate the retirement age minus the current age. So we need more lines of code. And so we are back to actually needing the curly braces in order to define a code block like this. So let's do what we just said. So calculate the age based on the birth year. So 37 minus the birth year. And now let's calculate the years until retirement, basically. And so let's say that the retirement age is 65 years, as it is in many countries, here in Europe at least. So 65 and then minus the current age. And that will then give us how many years we have left. And now to return this retirement, we actually need to write the return keyword explicitly. So we can only omit the return here in case we have a one-liner function like here. But if we have more, then we need to do the return still. So let's now run this function. So years until retirement, and then again some year. And then, as always, we could capture the return value into a variable. But this time, let's actually log that value to the console directly. So console.log, and yeah, so let's try that. And so it's 19. So, and that makes sense because 65 minus 46, which is the age, is 19. Okay, so that's the scenario when we have one parameter here and then more than one line of code, basically. And remember, in that situation, we need the return statement here. But now, what if we had multiple parameters? Well, then we need to wrap the parameters here into parentheses. So in VS Code, we can just select a variable and then write parentheses, and then it will automatically wrap this variable into parentheses on both sides. So let's say that we want the birth year, but also the first name, so that we can like return something else, like a sentence. So let's comment out this part here, and instead let's return a string. And again, we're using a template string here to build that string. And basically I want to say like first name retires in X years. So let's use that placeholder here. So first name retires in, and then we use that value that we just calculated. So retirement, give it a save here, and now we need to call it. And so let's add the second argument here so that it will go to the second parameter. So the first one here is of course birth year, and so that corresponds to 1991. And now the second argument will go to the second parameter, which is the first name. So let's say Jonas, and let's just call it twice, so that it actually makes more sense that we even put this logic into its own function. So let's say that Bob was born in 1980, and so let's see how many years he has left. So Jonas retires in 19 years, Bob retires in 8 years. Great. And that's essentially how the arrow functions work. You just need to keep in mind the couple of different scenarios that there are regarding to the number of lines of code that you need and the number of parameters. So as you add more code and more parameters, it gets a little bit more complex, and we kind of lose the advantage of using an arrow function. So now you might ask the same question as before. What type of function should I use? Should I use arrow functions for everything since they are so easy to write? And well, the answer is no, but it's also complicated. That's because there is another fundamental difference between the arrow function and more traditional functions. So function declarations and function expressions. It's the fact that arrow functions do not get a so-called this keyword. And this, once more, is a topic for much later. So remember that learning is not at all a linear process. And so topics need to build up on one another in an incremental way. Otherwise, you would just get super overwhelmed and super stressed if I were to tell you everything at the same time. So for now, we will actually keep using mainly the normal functions, except for very simple one-liner functions. For example, like this one here. And that doesn't mean that arrow functions are not important. They absolutely are, and I love them and I use them all the time. Sometimes I don't write regular functions at all. But again, you cannot yet understand all the implications of using arrow functions. So for now, again, we will keep using probably the function expressions the most.